Hello and welcome to episode 47 of the TRUUMAN Podcast, the podcast designed to create a generation of self-defined men. Today, I'm joined by Lau, the founder and presenter of the Mentality Podcast. Lau, how are you doing today?
All right, thank you. Great to be here, Lewis.
Amazing. Thanks for being here. And as always, I'll start with arguably the hardest question on the planet. In your own words, what makes you a man?
Well, good questions. I think, there are certain things that so many aspects that I would say, in my view, makes me a man. Obviously, it could start with the biology, my body, and everything that defines me in that way. But also, I think how I choose to see myself, how I perceive myself, and I would say it's kind of encompasses that element of my perception of what it means to be a man, of gender. Also, maybe because this is kind of the context while growing up, I was, they reinforced my message that I was having, you're a man, you're a boy, and so on and so on. So I think these are the inner and the outer factors that would lead to me defining myself as a man in a very generic, very high level way.
Amazing. And Lau, why don't you tell us a little bit about you, what it is that you do, and outside of the podcast, and a little bit about the podcast as well?
Absolutely. So yeah, my full name is Lau Ciocan. I'm the founder and director of Mentoring Advocacy Network. It's a platform that raises awareness around men's mental health and promotes conversation around healthy masculinities. And the reason I say masculinity is because I believe there are multiple ways of being a man. And at the same time, it's the link between mental health and masculinities, because I believe how we view ourselves as men shapes how we express ourselves, how we engage with ourselves, but also with others, and can at times, because of a restricted view of a kind of, some people might call it toxic view of being as a man, can lead to some men. Of course, there are multiple ways why men have mental health issues, but I think one factor is the way we engage with our emotions, with ourselves, and how we allow ourselves to express them or not. So in doing that, I've created this platform. I've held several webinars. I've done a lot of blogging around different topics about masculinity, men's issues. And 2 years ago, I've set up this mentality podcast that I believe it's a great way to engage with men of different backgrounds, just to have several conversations around what's, I believe, important for men. For example, like loneliness, diet, friendship, things that I think that they're day to day, but maybe sometimes we don't take time to spend time and discuss them a bit more in detail. So yeah, that's kind of what I do. That's what the podcast is about. I encourage people to check it out as well, or while they're listening to your podcast as well. So yeah.
Well, off all that, and obviously the conversations that we've had before, I'm really looking forward to this podcast and getting into in depth on a lot of those subjects with you. But I guess with a lot of my guests, there's usually a story as to how you ended up in this space. So why don't you take us back to that?
Well, I think the story is, and fun enough, I've kind of shared a bit on my TEDx talk around what it means to be a good man. So again, I encourage listeners to plug into that as well. But as I share there as well, is the idea of, I think growing up, I had a good context. Like my parents looked after me, everything was great. But also I felt that something was missing. And as I was looking up to my dad in terms of what it means to be a man, there was my kind of role figure, father figure. But I felt that I need a bit more than just him looking after me or my mom, ensuring that we have everything we need in the house. And that led me on a journey of self-discovery, trying to understand a bit more what it means to be a man beyond the practical things. And in this self-discovery in this journey that I've been, I've kind of started to work on myself and dig into it. Again, I'm not a perfect person, I'm not a perfect man, I'm still working on it. But I think for me was the idea of how can I address the things that the issues that I have, the issues that I've been dealing with. And in that journey, I realized, okay, there are a few things that I've learned. Why do I, again, do something about it, share that information and provide it to other men, other people that want to engage, use it in order to help themselves or help others to become a better person, better man as well. So I think in a nutshell was this idea of like looking of my father would kind of, he was, and he still is in a way very much not an expressive person about who he is, and wanted to, what a bit, it made me feel a bit, left me hungry for more. Like I think there's more to it when it comes to manhood. Along the way, I've looked at my grandfather, my uncle, other mentors that I picked up on the way, other male figures, and that inspired me to see, okay, there's something else, there's something more that I can look into, aspire when it comes to be a man. So this is kind of some of the very, again, highlights, the high points of my journey. So yeah.
One of the things that I'm sort of looking at right now is positive male role models. Obviously, with that being this year's theme for International Men's Day, it's something that's worth looking into. I wonder what your thoughts are, and it's something that I sort of encourage people to do, which is to look at a number of mentors. Obviously, our fathers and our fathers' fathers may have only grown up with their father as their role model. What do you think are some of the benefits to finding more role models outside of that traditional role?
I would say is crucial. For example, one of my mantras are positive role models save lives. Because, and the reason I say positive role models, because they can be negative role models. Sometimes we just assume that it's a role model, it's automatically, it's a given, it's a positive one. I would
Yeah.
say that, like similar with leaders, there are good leaders and bad leaders. So I would say that it's absolutely paramount for one's development. And I like this African saying of it takes a village to raise a child. And in this kind of African cultures, the idea of like uncles and aunties, like when you raised as a boy, as a girl, and so on, you grow up with extended family because it accepts the limitation that as a father, in this case, we're talking about fathers, is it, father, like we when we are or became fathers, for those who are, I think there's a limited capacity that we can handle, we can give, and that's why it's important to have, other mentors, for example, or as I said, uncles in our lives. They can pour in the things that probably our fathers lack. So I think that's why it's important to kind of supplement to ensure that we get a more nutritious, if I compare it with a male, more nutritious, I would say, palate or input in our upbringing as boys, and that's why I think it's helpful to reach out to seek of different type of relationship that can teach us different things, and give in our lives.
I like the meal analogy and the nutrition side of it. I think one thing that I'm always pushing for is choosing bits of different people. So this is probably something that we'll segue into, but there's obviously a lot of role models, not to use the word positive or negative, just role models online for young boys to access and men to access as well. But they sort of follow them blindly. There seems to be this sort of influencer culture where whatever they say is true, and they're almost creating sort of mini cults. And for me, it's a case of how do you find the best bits of what all of these people are saying to make, in your analogy, the tastiest, most nutritious meal possible? Is that something else that you encourage as well?
It's a good question, and to keep the meal analogy, I'm not aware of all the kind of the influences, the digital mentors that are out there and trying to grab attention of young boys, of men as well, to share, and with the hook that they are providing help or feeding into. But I think, as with any meal, there are some good meals, but also that, again, this is my mantra. There are certain meals that I don't think they're nutritious. Like, even if they might have some look-alike benefits or things into it, I wouldn't recommend to kind of engage with. Like, I mean, let's take the obvious example of Andrew Tate. Yes, there might be a few things that are kind of true or be helpful, but there's so much unhealthy ultra processed food that he's giving you, that for you to get to the nutritious bits that are probably tiny is not worth the energy. It's not worth to kind of try to dig in all the dirt that is there just to find, a milligram of gold. It's, when you can maybe go and find pure gold somewhere else much, much easier without being intoxicated getting dirty, your hands are so dirty in a not in a healthy way, in a good way, trying to find that tiny piece of gold.
Why? Well, I guess the answer's obvious, but it'd be good to hear it from you. Why do you think a lot of young boys and young men are enticed by those sort of influences online?
Well, I'm not sure what are the things that maybe I'm curious to hear your thoughts about, like what makes it so obvious. But I think it might be, several reasons. One is that I think there's a hunger in many ways for emotional presence, emotional connection with that is, and I'm going to drop the P word, it's because of patriarchy. I think because the way we've been wired as a society, how we've been in a way, yeah, nurtured as men in a way to engage with other men. But I think there's so many reasons. Like, can be also to pick another issue is that sometimes because of several reasons, because for example, a young family is trying to raise their children, but probably they're struggling with their bills, they have to overwork, and then the father, the mother probably as well, they're not have enough time, they're hungry of time, short of time, and they create that hunger for connection, for relationships in the family, doesn't allow to build that connection. So might be so many reasons why this that they need, or for they think in a way there's definitely a hunger for connection, for relationship, for also for role models, as you mentioned earlier, that leads to this surge out there. But also might be loneliness, might be trauma, might be an easier, quick way to find for information, search for information. Again, just to go back to the analogy of food, like it's easier to go and have a protein bar than going, which is not necessarily bad in itself, but it's not, we wouldn't recommend to have it every day as a meal. It's like additional to the meal instead of cooking yourself a good meal. So the same is I'm going quickly online to listen to, one of these influencers, and then you get you what you need, your fix that for the things you're looking for, and makes you feel a bit okay. Maybe I found the answers. When maybe the answer sometimes takes a bit longer to get there.
Yeah, for me, it's yeah, patriarchy is probably the starting point of it. I think
Mm-hmm.
capitalism as well, and the status within a capitalist society is having money, and it's very easy if you see someone wealthy to just instantly respect them, rightly or wrongly. And I think that's probably the simplest reason as to why people are intoxicated or interested in what these people have to say, because at the end of the day, that's what makes this world that we currently live in turn is money. And if you have a lot of it, you have people's ears, rightly or wrongly. And yeah, I think that's one of it. So
Sorry
one of
if
the
I
things
can.
that
So
no,
when I
no, please.
just jump in, I think that was the thing that I wanted to drop the C word as well, capitalism. But I said, like, look, I've no one just like name drop. That's why I referred to the idea of the young family who's trying to provide, and looking, and they don't have time to look after their children because they have to be in the cycle, either because they're not financially well off, or maybe because they are quite good, quite happy financially, but they want to strive for more. So again, the idea of cycle of like you're always on a rat race to whatever, from 50% to 60%, or from 20 to 30 as well. So yeah, I totally agree. And obviously there are other culprits as well, like racism, social injustices that we could delve into, why there's so much trauma, why people looking for those quick wins online. But I think to your point, there's influencers like, again, like just to take the big cats out, like Andrew Tate. He's definitely not only talking about men's issues, but also talking about how you can be famous, rich, and all that. That again is linked to capitalism, to having to be affluent in that way.
Yeah, he hits the nail on the head when it comes to that side of things. In regards to um, sort of so we talk you use the analogy of nutrition and there not being too much nutrition there, and but there is stuff there, there is bits of gold within the dialogue that's sort of put out, and it's you are sieving for it in that way. Do you think it's right to label all people in that space with the words toxic masculinity?
Just to make sure I get it right, when you mean all the people in that space, do you mean the people who are engaging with the content? You mean all the influencers? Like, just to make sure where which kind
Yeah,
of
yeah,
people,
yeah.
which group you're referring to?
Yeah, essentially. So it's both really. So you get I have friends who are teachers who have to just use Andrew Tate as the simple part of this, where they would sort of punish or encourage them not to engage in that content, and then off the back of that, other influencers sort of fell into that trap. Jordan Peterson is another example that has sort of been brushed with toxic masculinity. Do you think that's helpful or a useful use of that phrase?
Yeah, the use of the phrase toxic masculinity, to be honest, I looked into it as well, and it's funny that now it's so ubiquitous. Like, it's absolutely everywhere and very easily thrown. Oh, that's toxic masculinity, or that you behave like to somebody or a group and so on. And I think in the past, like in the 80s, it was very used on like feminist class in university. So it was very niche, was very an academic term. And now it's, as I mentioned, it's easily dropped in almost every conversation. And I remember when I started my platform, it was like ranking one of the highest search when you put toxic, and the next thing would come masculinity, not toxic food, toxic waste, toxic masculinity. So it showed the use of it. And I don't think necessarily it's okay to just throw that around, because sometimes, yeah, even if people like, let's say, let's give the children the benefit of doubt, the boys the benefit of doubt, that they are looking for a source and they don't know. Again, to kind of, I wouldn't say that, for example, if a child goes and, you know, because he's hungry, ends up in a a store that sells fries and chips and fried chicken and burgers, like they're toxic. Or if they go there once and then maybe they never go again, or they will go several times. I think it very much depends. I would basically, what I'm saying is, I would avoid using oversweeping generalization or to people who might do certain things. I think in the end, the behavior is the critical thing, like what they will do, how they behave with themselves or with others. They might be, then you can one label them toxic for that regard. But just because maybe once somebody listened to, I mean, I once listened to, or I listened several times to Andrew Tate, to just see what he has to say, to understand, not just to hear regurgitated views about him. I've listened to, and obviously to form my own opinion. I don't believe that makes me toxic. But if you are a fan and you know, there's the spectrum, so that's why I think I wouldn't encourage just an easy use of that term. So I would maybe recommend cautious in some regards.
I think my view on it is that it's almost diluted the word masculinity altogether, which it would be interesting to sort of talk on your side of things with masculinities and what that looks like, because it's really hard to just find anything that was perceived as masculine that you do now not to be perceived as toxic, whether that's from extreme feminism or feminist movements, or it is just becoming more mainstream. I'm not too sure, but let's sort of delve into that and let's sort of try and carve out what is masculinity to you.
Yeah, that's a good question about what is masculinity. So I would say, in many ways, I think I'll go to the patriarchy comparison. Is that back in the day, our fathers, our grandfathers, they had quite a very scripted, very niche way of what it means to be a man. It was very clear cut, very black and white. I think nowadays we don't live in that world anymore. And although there's certain aspects of that come with that traditional way of being a man, for example, like being a provider, protecting your partner, being stable, and so on and so on, they they are good, and I think they are desirable traits that I know even women who very clearly they identify as feminist, they would like to have a stable partner and so on, which, because they are desirable traits. However, there are certain things that we are shedding off, the things that we perceive as being toxic, like being controlling, dominant, and avoiding connection, just to name a few, that I think they are healthily and happily left behind because they didn't serve those around us, this case, family, partners, and so on, but didn't serve us others as men. I think this is one thing that, when it comes to, we sometimes, I've seen that how we as men perceive the idea of patriarchy, and that always just women have an issue, or feminist the feminists have an issue with, because it can be men who are feminists as well, so have an issue with the idea of patriarchy. But I think we don't address it as men. We don't speak enough about it to see that we also are thoroughly affected by this. As I like to say this sometimes, because no man gets out of it alive, in the sense that we end up killing ourselves because we don't allow ourselves to have that connection. And it's because of that we are also the victims of patriarchy. And yes, although sometimes there are a few men who are the winners, but they're not always the winners, in the sense that it's very hard to stay always on top. It's quite volatile. But I think we should be discussing how this affects us and look into it and having those conversations as men. And I think, going back to your question, what it means to be a man, is, I think this is the thing. That's why I mentioned masculinity is a term that, again, has been coined by others, is the idea that trying to come with a new set of rules of what's healthy masculinity, or what is masculinity, it just leads to the same trap laid before that. Okay, this is the new list that we need to follow, and then if you don't, we're going to bully you, we're going to punish you, we're going to ostracize you, just so you become the healthy version. And I think that's not helpful. That's why I will not, obviously I can give you some flavor of it, but I wouldn't say that's kind of the golden grail, or the holy grail that we should be aiming nowadays, because that's not where we should be heading to.
No, I think I actually did a talk on this recently, and it's something that really interests me. And it's arguably now is the best time ever to be a man. We talk about patriarchy and all the past stuff and how that was amazing, and it's always been amazing to be a man. For me personally, I think now is the best time to be a man. As you've touched on, 1% of men are at the top and benefit from patriarchal societies and capitalist societies. That's just the way that it works. But as feminism has risen, and as women have gained equality, that also means that men have gained equality. We've moved away from having to be a provider. We've moved away from having to be tough all the time. It allows us to do what we want. We have this big push for women in STEM. Where's the push for men out of STEM? There must be some men there that don't want to be there. And that, for me, is what's exciting about this. But what I think is lacking is this conversation. I think it's just a case of women, women up, women up, women up, and not bringing men into the conversation. I think that's a much more healthier way of looking at it. And it sort of ticks into what you're saying about there is no rules. Just do what you sort of want to do, as long as it's inherently good and you are a good person. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, to be a good person, I think one element is like, how can we learn to see connection? How can we connect to, again, I sound like a broken record, but connect first of all to ourselves? Because if we cannot connect to ourselves, how can we learn to connect to others? And I think, to your point about, I think there's a lot of good discussions about parental leave, like how do men want to spend time with their families, and there's more increasing attention to that. But you're right, I haven't seen any man or anyone campaigning for more men nurses, right? Or more, there have been some discussions and conversations in the past about male teachers, and it's quite really low in the UK compared to, for example, Scandinavian countries, where the number of primary school teachers or just caregivers in, for example, in the kindergarten, who are male. And again, going back to the idea of role modeling, that's one big issue, because those boys growing there, they see just the female being the caregivers or the models in that space. And if they unfortunately if they come from a single parent family, and there's the mom, who most of the time is, again, where is the connection with the male, with the role models that they might lack? Because, okay, you might come from a single family, unfortunately, and then the mom is the person looking after you, but at least that can be complemented a bit with having a male teacher, having a male caregiver. So I think that's some way that can be done in a way. But yes, it would be great to have more campaigns, more conversations, and something that I'm passionate about. And I totally agree, we need to have more conversations like this. And also, I would say, yes, it's capitalism, but also it's like white supremacy as well, that we look at. That's why certain type of men end up to the top most of the time, and not only other groups from other backgrounds as well. So I think the culprits are quite big, but they are quite interrelated because they usually come together. There's not only one of them. The same with the intersectionality. Like there's so many layers of what makes us being a man, who we are, our identity, from gender, but religious background to ethnicity to class to sexual orientation is so much broader. And you're right, today is much more, it is much more nuanced and more complex, but it's beautiful in a way to be a man. But also, I disagree that the golden age of the man was like when our grandparents were alive. Yes, because those are the myths that practically tell us, oh, those were the good days, and now things are. I don't think it was great to be a man in the 60s, work in a factory all day. And for example, if you take a working class position, or the quality of life, I would say, wasn't that great either, if you ask me, from at least from what I've seen, from what I've looked into. So I would say, yeah, absolutely, today is a great day to be a man.
Yeah. Well, it always makes me laugh because whenever you talk about like history in general, it's all about like how far we've come and how more advanced we are. But when you talk about a specific being a man, that apparently was better then, and this is men have always been on top, but everything else has got better over time. So yeah, maybe it's time to have that conversation as well.
Yeah, yeah, I know, I agree. That's why we're having this conversation. That's why I think it's fabulous, and I'm happy to be here because we engaging and sharing these ideas.
No, it's great, and obviously you have your podcast as well, and yeah, the more the merrier of these is what I always say. So, in regards to your platform and the podcast, what are some of the good things that you've seen from sort of conversations like this, or what are things that you're sort of hopeful for in the future?
I think one thing that I've really enjoyed is like having a range of guests that share their experience, expertise on certain topics, and we can engage. And it's a two-way street, in the sense that we having that conversation, and it's engaging new insights, new ideas, new experiences come. And I'm not only hopefully the only the audience is enriched, but I feel as well that I'm learning, in a way, becoming more wholesome, in not wholesome but whole, in that sense. Like I feel like, oh, I learned something great from this conversation with this guest. Again, I also have women as guests in my podcast, and again, it was really nice to get this insight, the different perspective from a different angle about either masculinity or the challenges that women might have in regards to men, but also just having a conversation from let's say from a different angle as well. So this is kind of some in again very high terms, but one thing that I want to encourage, and we've been saying, we in terms of in the general message that we've been saying to men, and we're saying as well, that men need to open up, men need to kind of find those safe spaces, and I'm saying that as well. They need to find a safe space to open up. But I think equally, at times, that when I've been through certain challenges, I found that even if I was willing to be open and to share that, I think that's one step. And I think while we're saying this, that message shouldn't stop. We also need to learn as society to learn to listen. Because if all those men that we encourage to kind of go and share their emotions, share their feelings, and find connections, but if in the end, if there's no one there to listen and to receive their message, you might find some people like, well, I've tried it once, I tried it twice, I'm tired of it. I actually stick to our old ways because clearly it's not working. Or they might have bad experiences, and then they might end up, again, even more toxic. So I think, I'm not blaming on the other, but I think we need to also learn, as men open up, how we can ensure that we receive and welcome those feelings, emotions, and sit with them. Not necessarily say that everything what men will share is okay and right, but how do we do that in a helpful way, and we make space and time for that as well.
Yeah, I've had that conversation a couple of times as well, where the listening part is ironically the most important part. I think men do talk. I think there are plenty of spaces that men have talked for years. I just don't think there's any spaces that men have truly listened. For example, the pub, the golf course, the working men's club. There's always going to be conversations. There's always going to be the wife's nagging me, the kids are pissing me off, whatever it is. These are conversations that are had. It's just how are they listened to? And I think as men, we either ignore or try and find a solution most of the time. I think it's only now, by understanding this again from having number of guests on, that I understand what listening is rather than just trying to spurt something out and trying to come up with a solution, or just ignore it entirely. So yeah, I completely agree. I think men, if they're the receiver of information from someone, need to understand how to listen. I guess my question to that is, in your expertise or in your opinion, how do you do that?
It's a good question, because I think it starts with, I think, as I said, creating that safe space that people can share, and there's no judgment to whatever is shared, even if it might be something controversial or a bit more sinister as well. Obviously, there's limits to that, because if something really sinister, you need to kind of address the challenge that. But I think in principle, like, how do you welcome that, how you embrace it? And in my experience, when I was the person who was listened to, what helped me was to, as I said, have that safe space to share things, what I'm going through, what are my challenges, and literally to be listened to actively, in the sense that not to be interrupted. And if I feel like I want to just go on a rant for 6 minutes, allow those 6 minutes to be uninterrupted. And instead of, as you say, get the superhero in us to come and save, to the person to save me and to say, oh, Lau, I think you should be doing this. This is a solution. Go and, this are the 3 steps you need to do. You'll be happily ever after. They put more questions. They asked me, okay, so what are your thoughts about this? Or have you tried this? Or why are you saying this to me? Or what led you to take this step, and so on. So maybe lead with some questions, and allow me for me to kind of go through the motions, find the solution that works for me. So I think, yeah, number one is just listen as much as possible, listen attentively, listen to the details. And second is try to ask questions. And yes, maybe I would say, if you just to keep with the magic number of 3, is probably the third thing would be just to kind of encourage to some more reflection from my end, something that I, again, reflection would to lead to an action that I can reflect on and doing something. So this would be probably the things that I've seen that worked on my end, that I'm trying to replicate and emulate in my listening to other men, my wife. So it's just like trying to be that person in listening this way. I know it maybe not work for everybody, but this is what I find it very helpful and worked for me.
Yeah, I'm not going to add, because that was the whole point of that question, was for you to share what works for you, and hopefully that might work for someone else. And that's the idea of this podcast, right? I don't have all the answers. You don't have all the answers. But as a collective, if we keep having conversations like this with more people and different people, you might find an answer that works for you. So that's the whole concept here. So yeah, try it, see if it works for you. In regards to the men's space, what have you been pleasantly surprised about sort of over the last, let's say, 5 years? What do you think's working really well? And what do you think there needs to be more of?
So I think, as you said, there's been a growing conversation, growing debate about what it means to be a man. And I think there were a lot of conversation as well that what a man shouldn't be like, the toxic aspect of masculinity. So I think we're starting to move away from that, in a way that this is what is not working, this is the bad thing, that the harm that we created as a group. So we started saying, well, we're still having those debates, but I think we're also moving towards like what it means to be a man, the positive side of like masculinity, in terms of like, okay, these are things that actually are working or should be working. So that's the beauty of it that I've seen over the last years. I think it's more openness about mental health and how it affects us. I think more men are coming to ask for help and reach out. Although when it comes to suicide, the numbers are still high and quite constant in that regard. But in terms of the debate, I've seen more conversation around that. I think that's really helpful and quite proactive in that regard. So I think another thing that I really like is that seeing the variety of debates or conversation of men of again, different ethnic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, different spaces are having this conversation. And again, as you said, there's no shortage of need of covering that intersectionality of what it means to be a man that is taking place. But I think we also have seen like different TV shows around this on different channels about masculinity, what it means to be a man, mental health, and so on. But at times I think they I don't want to be critical, but sometimes I feel they fell a bit short. Like they think they could be either more nuanced or go into depth, or they're a bit superficial. Like, I will personally, I would like a bit more consistency in terms of, when I say consistency, I don't mean like to be the same, but to be more meaty. I mean, just go into that nuance and carve that issues out. And yeah, this is kind of, I feel that would be interesting to have. And I think a lot of times we see the experiences of maybe high profile men, which obviously they are valid, but also at times I struggle to relate to that because I remember listening to a podcast around men's issues, and there was a guy who was from a rock band, and he was saying his challenges and how the the journey he went through. And at one point, he was saying how he went off stage and people like shouting, and he was so excited about him and the insight he was having because of that and his journey. But for me, it was like, for me, it was hard to relate to that because that's not what I do. Like when I leave my home, actually people are knowingly jumping in front of me to get in the bus or the train, or all that, or maybe I need to. Nobody gives me any attention. Like, quite not that I would need it, but I'm just saying my lifestyle and my life is very different. So for me, it's like, how can we bring men like you and I, again, men again from different spheres as well, but like what I mean, everyday men, to have this conversation in a public space. And I remember I was asking my wife, like, hey, I'm originally from Romania, so I grew up there and I moved only like 10 years ago here. I remember when I was growing up in Romania, there were TV shows, was called, I think, Chat with Friends or something like that. It was a moderator, and he was inviting different group of people, like kind of teenager people, like there was the age that was kind of trying to aim at, and having different conversations, quite literally the way we have now, was like a live podcast about friendship, about sexuality, about things that would care, that you would interested in, would would tickle you at that age. And it was quite nice to just listen and be stimulated, and it would just everyday people. They obviously, they were same guests at times, but they were having those. Then the panel wasn't like three people and that's it. It was like a big number of like, I know, 7, 8 people, and they were taking turns to that. So I think I would like to see more of that in a way in the shows that we presented online.
I want to find more people I disagree with. I think that's one of the big problems with toxic masculinity and this side of things, is like it's very much you're either in it or you're not. And it's like, well, like I want to find people that challenge me on things. I think today there were things that you disagreed with what I said and things that I disagreed with what you said. And I think that's good. I think that's healthy. I think that's what society is. I think we live a lot in echo chambers because that is what social media algorithms are designed to do. They're designed to keep you on the app. They're not going to annoy you or wind you up with something that you disagree with because you're going to leave. And I think we need more of that. I think we need debates around it. I think conversations around feminism and what that means for men. Like, wow, that's probably the scariest sentence to say, but it needs to be said more. Like, it's good, but what does it mean for men? I think is really important. And I think conversations with boys around testosterone and understanding their bodies as they change, I think that needs to be improved. I think there's a lack thereof because there isn't anything significant happening, shall we say. There isn't menstruation and that side of things. So it's less talked about. And I think that's a conversation that needs to be had and I think is missed a little bit.
If I can just ask you about why do you think it's so fearful, or why do you think that's a big thing to have a conversation around what feminism means for men as well?
I think it's just being pushed. I think the narrative is that you see in mainstream media is that men have had it the best for 50, 60 years, whatever you want to class as this period. And it's women's time. And that shouldn't be what it is. That's my view on it. That's what I see it as. That's what a lot of my peers see it as. I've had these conversations. And I think it's time to have, I think, like you say, there are conversations around paternity, which I think are great. And that's a starting point. But it's all about women becoming in power, becoming CEOs, or pay disparity in football. It's not a conversation about, like you say, men becoming nurses or men leaving STEM or men becoming stay-at-home dads or men wanting to be artists rather than working in finance, but they still feel that they have to be a provider and they have to abide by this traditional role that essentially doesn't exist, both societally or economically. So that's why I think it's a tough question to have, because it's tipping the apple cart the way that it needs to go to actually get equality.
Well, yeah, I hear you. I think I see it slightly different. I understand, I mean, it was even, I was told to my face, like, remember clearly the time and place. And I was like, some time ago, I was like, well, it's our time now. And obviously, I'm personally quite ambitious, I'm driven, and I don't want to feel like I'm now pushed aside just because I'm a man. Obviously, that wouldn't feel fair. And honestly, I'm not saying this is what they implied, but this is how it landed with me, and it felt like that to me. But at the same time, I think it's okay for us to kind of still encourage, women, if they want to be CEOs, if they want to be nurses, whatever, to choose whatever they want to have that choice, as we have. Technically, we had that choice, but we didn't have all that choice, because not if men wanted to be nurses, I think men would laugh at you or would say, no, there's a job for only for women at that time. Obviously there was different times, and you might argue that it wasn't happening in the 50s and 60s or 30s. It was happening for centuries, where men were in power, dominating and doing all that. So we had it for quite a long time. But I think the flip side, and what I think is, well, what stops us to have this conversation? Like, if men want to be nurses, want to be teachers, or men want to be, and you're right that the idea with patriarchy is that they also harm women. Would like, no, I want you to be the provider, and they're like, just because somebody's a female or male, that doesn't mean automatically they'll be feminist or not, or vice versa. But I think if we want to, let's have more conversation around this campaigns. And when I don't think women should go out and say, obviously, all that will benefit them and benefits them as well, should be saying like, no, men should be, should be more, involved. Obviously they said it for a long time, but I think we should be leading, and as men are leading the campaign for equal parental leave, because it benefits, from the baby to the mother to the father to society. So I think it's just for us to have those conversations a bit more. I think, and we can be actively involved in those conversations. This is at least how I see it. But I understand it can be challenging, because not everybody sees it the way I do or you do. So therefore, there will be some challenges, some sparks in those conversations. But nevertheless, I think we should just naturally have them.
Yeah, no, I'm all for having them. I think we're at a stage where it seems to be okay to have these conversations. Maybe when I started this, and maybe when you started your podcast as well, talking a couple of years ago now, it was almost a little bit taboo to be having a conversation about men and being with a man, like, and talking about being a man, not being with a man in a
Mhm.
homosexual way. That's
No, again, no, I got it. Yeah.
yeah, a few years ago that was taboo. But yeah, this that was that was how it felt at the beginning, whereas now it feels a lot more okay. And yeah, I'm hopeful that we can continue moving that ball forward as well. Rising tide rises all ships. That one. So as we move towards pure equality and what that looks like, more conversations will happen with men, because I think it's been noticed that boys, let's say boys particularly, because I think that's where the notice is happening, are falling behind a lot in a number of things. So it only took a few years to notice it, but yeah, it is happening, just not at the pace maybe we would like it to happen at. What?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. What's your thoughts on that?
I think so. So just a thought that came to my mind about you. You mentioned about testosterone in boys, and I think it's important in this conversation around men's issue, boys' issue, masculinity, to acknowledge that we are biologically wired slightly different. And then how do you engage with it? How do you respect that? How do you appreciate that? Because if you take a young boy, he has more energy, on average, physically is much stronger than a woman, and again, on average, it's important to acknowledge that, and how we work constructively with that, while he can still be a boy, but at the same time making sure that the things we encourage and nurture within him is not only about like certain way, like you this again, to open the spectrum of options that he could choose, than just like, you're a boy, you definitely, you go it, you climb the trees, you push, you're going to be an army boy, or you're going to be a lawyer, or you're going to be a doctor. But also, if you want to be, a cook, if you want to be a tailor, if you want to be this, a nurse or teacher, the wall is there, you go and get it. What do you want to do, basically? But also to acknowledge that if there are boys who have that drive, we still need people with that drive, and again, just encourage that, but to do it in a non-dominant way, in a connecting way. I would say so.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Like Billy Elliot, film, ballerina, Northern England, mining
Mm,
time. Like he used a lot of energy and he still sort of lived as a boy in that sense. But there was obviously that pressure, and that's what that film's all about. But if that's what someone wants to be now, that's totally fine. And
mm,
it's having those conversations. I think we're well away from men feeling that they can dominate their way to the top. I'm not too sure. It's an interesting question. I'll have to think about that, and sort of picture that together. But I think we're past
mm,
that. I think we're well past that. I think maybe societally it's impossible. I'm not too sure, but I will think about that.
mm.
But yeah,
Just one point about you mentioned Billy Elliot, like fun enough. Like, so I used to live in Denmark at one point, and I was part of a kind of a crew that we was invited to randomly to do a show, like people, boys of foreign background. There were a lot of guys who were Danish, but they were like having different ethnic backgrounds. I was again non-Danish, but I had a foreign background, so I was invited to be part of that theater piece. And we had a teacher, a dance teacher. Fun enough, he was Scottish. His name was Bill, and he had very gracious moves, very elegant, very like he was also a dancer. I'm not sure if he was a ballerina, but he was definitely a dancer, a professional dancer. He was teaching us how to be on stage, how to dance, how to do all these things. But he was such a masculine man. Like I wouldn't doubt for a second that he wasn't masculine. I wouldn't say that he was in like camp or anything. There was nothing about that. You know, when he would speak, you would listen to him. He had authority, he had presence. But when he would dance, he was so elegant and so flexible. So again, what I'm saying with this is things are not necessarily always black and white. If you're this way, this package will follow through. So I think how can we allow ourselves, and I'm teaching myself the same thing, how can I allow myself the flexibility to perceive and to build myself, or to see others in this way. It's like, there are multiple ways of to skin a cat. Like there's not just, if you do this automatically will lead to this. Like it's not that domino effect all the time.
well, you said it right at the beginning. You're not a perfect man. You probably never will be a perfect man. You're always learning and you're always testing things. And I think that's
Mm,
something that's really important for boys and men to continue doing. That's why I asked the question, what makes you a man? I think it's a
mm,
question that should be asked at all chapters of your life, when you're single, growing up, when you get married, when you have kids, when you have grandkids, when you change jobs, whatever it might be. I think you need to
mm.
always ask that question. But I think that's a really nice place to leave it. But what I will do is I will hand the floor to you. Lau, you can let people know where to find you, and I'll let you end with some final thoughts.
Thank you, Lewis. It was a really great conversation. Really enjoyed it being here. So thank you for having me. And I would just say people can search on Spotify or Apple Podcasts for the Mentality Podcast, where they can hear the conversation I'm having with men, women about men's issues. And they can find more on either on LinkedIn. They can search for Mentoring Advocacy Network, MAN, or for my profile, Lau Ciocan, and they can just find me there. And also they go for the website, which is www.manmentoring.org.uk. So I think my final thought for the podcast is there's just encouraged to grow and to learn about yourself as a man, and how the multiple healthy ways where you can express yourself in the connection, in building connection with others. Thank you, Lewis.